Hello and welcome to this week's review of My Hero Academia. This week I'm reviewing the episode Butterfly Effect, reminding one of the Ashton Kutcher movie of the same name. I don't know if he's in that movie, but whatever, we'll move on and we kick off this review, as we always do with these reviews, by talking about the positives, all the things I enjoyed about this episode, more or less. And the headline positives for this particular review is that this was a very effective meat and potatoes episode. I feel that the composite parts that make this episode up are dealt with very well, and I feel that it shakes up the stakes and builds them up effectively, even if it's not quite as effective as I really feel that it should have. I think it's a good time for me to just underline what I mean by calling this a meat and potatoes episode. I feel honestly deep down in the soul of my being that despite the scale and repercussions of the events and scenes that we're seeing unfolded before us in this episode, I think that this episode pretty much as a whole entity exists pretty much just to establish this scale of upcoming events and to establish upcoming events more so than it is to elevate and highlight the events they're in. This is not an episode that goes into deeper detail about the various scenes and people involved within them, not on a thematic level, not really an emotional level. It does it to a degree, but really not to the extent I really think it should do, but we'll discuss that shortly. This is an episode that is more about setting us up for what's coming next, what's happening later, the next 5 or 6 episodes of this season branching out into next season. That is the main focus of this episode. And I have to say that as an episode that ultimately boils down to just being connecting tissue between 2 points and not a point in and of itself, it is not pointless, and I think that it is good quality here. I feel that the emotional range of what we see and hear from our cast of performers is great, particularly towards the end of the episode where we have that shift with Toga and how she's gone from being creepy twisted to just rage-filled and twisted. I think that the writing that we get throughout is a tad too neat in certain regards. I don't think there's a whole lot of creative flair on offer here. Like I say, this is very meat and potatoes. This is the connecting tissue between 2 points. There is nothing here that is outright creative, but at the same time there's nothing here which is so mechanical and just so thoughtless and emotionless and heartless that it is uninteresting. I feel that it is incredibly efficient, but it feels like the dialogue is rather mechanical, as it all ultimately exists to just get us to the next stage. The scenes themselves pretty much just exist to get us to the next stage. It's a series of events which, whilst incredibly important towards these characters, ultimately it's a case of this is this thing that led to that thing, which led to that thing, which led to that thing, which makes a certain degree of sense given this episode is called Butterfly Effect and what Butterfly Effect means. Though I will admit that it doesn't really lead into the idea of butterfly effect on a emotional level, or rather a thematic level, to the extent I really think it should do. Because butterfly effect, chaos theory, call it whatever you want, it is ultimately a very core component of this series. Not the large overarching idea of the series, it's not the greater metatextual point, or subtextual point I should say. However, it is still something that has existed throughout the entire DNA of this series, right back to the very beginning into now. It is something that is underlined by all for one in this episode, where he essentially says people's life experiences in childhood shape who they are. Something I have frequently mentioned in this series was being a thing that I like about it. Everyone is here in this moment because their choices in their life, or choices by other people in their life, got them here. They became villains, or they became heroes, or they became heroes in training, or they became rioters because of how they were treated in their life and how that built up and got them to this point in where they are in this life. However, in this episode, it doesn't really lean into that idea. It is an episode that is more focused on chaos theory and butterfly effect on a mechanical sense of this character goes here, this character goes there, this character goes there, and so on and so forth, and how it builds out to this big final image that we end up seeing of all of that. This is not to say that it does not lean into it on an emotional level, it does not lean into it into a character level. I just don't feel that it leans into it to the extent that it really should do. We have it in this episode about how the way that Spinner was treated when he was younger is what ultimately made him go down a villainous path, which ultimately put him in the position that he was on in today to get Kurigiri, or whatever his name is, released from his cell. And how the death of Twice is what has led Toga to steal that character's power to create this sad man parade thing again. And it makes sense in that, but it feels as though the emotional, deeper weight of all of that has been absent from it. I know that that might sound very negative, bearing in mind that we're in the positives, but like I say, I think that just getting us to this point, how it does it in a mechanical sense is good. I just think the emotional side of it needed to be stronger. I think the series of events that we see in and of themselves are good. The aftermath of the riot is good, if short-lived. I like the fact that it is ultimately ended by the rioters realising that they've been manipulated and they've been tricked and they've had their head bent by people they shouldn't have been listening to, or people that have been trying to manipulate them to get to the ends that they are in. Yes, I know that in reality there would still be some holdouts. The whole momentum of the riot wouldn't have just ended there and then, but this is a TV show. There's other things going on here, so we can't really get too upset about that. I think that how it ends up dealing with it all is good, and I'm much happier for something like this to end in a way like this than end with superheroes punching each other and throwing people through buildings. I do think that it's missing more of an emotional rounding off than what we got. What we get with Soji in this series of events, what we get with Soji in this scene is decent enough, but it, like the scene as a whole entity, this part of it just ends up fizzling out, as everything that we have with Spinner and Present Mike is something that's more of an immediate threat and more of an immediate focus. Which is why I end up saying that this is an episode that's ultimately more focused about the connecting tissue, more so than it is about the emotive stuff, because there would be more of a focus on the emotive stuff. We probably would have started this episode with the aftermath of the riot, rather than having the jump forward and jump back thing that we end up seeing throughout the episode itself. The scene with Present Mike, I think, is largely solid. I'm not mad that he failed, I'm just disappointed that this whole scene was as short-lived as it was. It feels like it's setting up for a deeper dive into his backstory, his emotional history, about his time studying to be a hero, him and his friends, the three dumb amigos as he refers to them in the past. And whilst we have had hints of that, where we had scenes of that, it doesn't go into that anywhere near to the extent I really think that it should do for something like this. It's a neat little bit. He's setting it up like, right, he's going to do it. He's going to old Yeller his friend, and that doesn't end up happening. And I'm not annoyed that he failed. I'm just annoyed on how it was all handled. They could have done a thing where it made it look like he had succeeded, but then didn't. They could have... I just think that if anything else, they could have still had the same ending if they just spent more time just going into why this is so much of an emotional thing, how heavy all of this is for him, how it all fell apart, things like that. Now, this is stuff that might be explored at a later point in this season or next season, maybe next few episodes or so, but I think the absence of the emotional core, the greater emotional core in this scene is what was needed. The stuff with Shoto and Dabi, good, but it looks like we're not getting the whole cut here, are we? We're not getting the moment of Dabi waking up. We're not getting the moment of the, oh crap, he's awake, oh god, what's happening here? We're just getting people screaming and shouting, which is good in how it's put together from a cinematography standpoint, from a performative standpoint. It doesn't really go any further here. This is a setting up for an epic battle, and a battle so epic that it's disrupting weather patterns until it isn't, and then it ends almost immediately as it starts. You have that moment where Dabi is thinking, right, I want to murder my brother in front of my father, but I'm not going to have time to kill him and take him over there. Then it starts to look like he's going to try and lead Shoto over there, but doesn't, because the teleporty wibbly wobbly stuff comes into play, and it feels as though, again, it's more focused on setting up the next series of events, more so than it is drilling down into the emotional weight of this. This stuff with Uraraka and Toga. I liked elements of this. I like the fact that this scene and how both the characters carried themselves reflects how they progress both as individuals but also in their, for want of a phrase, respective careers. We've seen over the course of these past few seasons and this whole run of events, how Uraraka has gone from someone who wanted to be a hero to someone who's acting like a hero, someone who can coordinate and work alongside others to save the day. We see that how she works with the heroes that can sense people where the directions are and all that kind of stuff. We also see that with Toga, how she has gone from just someone who would run up at people going eee, to now having tactics and forethought and figuring out what she's going to do in order to do all of this stuff. And I like that kind of thing of it. I like the fact that it is these two characters who are ultimately paired up to fight against one another, because I think they've both gone down a similar trajectory as far as how their development as heroes and villains has ended up doing so, and the connection between the two of them, how one of them certainly feels about the other, I think is an interesting dynamic to have in a fight like this. However, after, what is it, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks of not seeing either one of them, to then having it all of a sudden turn around and go, alright now, we're going now, bye-bye, I've got a superpower, I'm disappearing into a portal, goodbye. And whilst I did like the thing of, oh, I didn't get a chance to talk to you about love, and the look on the twice copy's face, look of regret. Yeah, I like that moment, but it feels like it should come at the other side of a longer series of events where we truly get this deeper dive into these characters in this moment, how they're both feeling, how they're both dealing with all of this, which is something we don't get. And all these events together ultimately boiling us down to this feeling of, they're only doing this because we need more bodies, we need more minions, we need something that's going to drag out this big final confrontation even more, something that's going to add to the scale of it, something that's going to add to the drama of it, something that's going to add to the action of it. And I'm not keen on that, because I think that, like I say, I think each and every single one of these series events we see in this episode are good. There's an argument to be made you could make an entire episode based around all of them. But I think that, like I say, at the end of the day, the desire to pull the twist lever was done far too soon. And I still think is that at the core of it, the idea of doing this is still good. It just feels like this whole episode, this whole, right, everyone's going to converge now, is something that should be happening towards the end of this season. I think that the idea of twisting it to make it more difficult for our heroes is good. I think it is interesting. I think it works for a series like this. Can't say I'm the biggest fan of it, but I think it worked again for a series like this. Our heroes were starting to get into a better position, or rather, let's be honest, a position. Looking to it like they might actually be able to pull this thing off. Looking like they'll be in a position where they can make a go of this, save the day, and that all of them might get out of this alive. And then what happens? All for One kicks the table from under them and makes everything harder. He is using every tool at his disposal to do this, because let's face it, all his minions are just tools to him, all means to an end. And him drawing as many people as he can do into this fight he's involved with makes sense, because it makes it harder for the heroes. It means that there's more people they've got to be aware of, more people they've got to try and save and protect and work with. They can't abandon people, they can't leave them to their own devices. Great idea. Makes sense in the context of the villain that's trying to put all this together. Makes sense from a purely visceral superhero punchy action side of the things. I get it. I get all of it. Visually, stylistically, narratively, everything we see in this moment, in this episode, makes sense. The timing less so. This feels like the kind of thing that you would see as part of a mid-series break or an end-of-season twist. You thought things were going this way, you thought that things were going to go like this, you thought our heroes might have this in the bag. Well, surprise, they're not. Again, I think the composite elements in this episode are good. I think that each of the ideas behind the scenes are good, and whilst I think that each and every single one of them could have been done better, at the end of the day, I think that they are good. And again, I think that the idea of this twist is still good. I think it still works. I think there's still an energy and enthusiasm and an action and a flair to it. I think that it is visually interesting, particularly that final moment where you've got all these copies of Twice that Toga has created just flopping and falling almost lifelessly at this portal, to the point you've just got this mountain of bodies just sprawling out and covering the battlefield. I think that's a fantastic visual image. I think that it is great from a visual standpoint. I think that it works well. I just think the timing of it is just kind of screwy. And yeah, I will to reflect on what I said many weeks ago. Yes, I think it was silly to break them all off into these fighting game arenas. And as tired as I am of seeing bombed out cities, it's weird that now it looks like we're going to have our big final confrontation with this bad guy in a Dragon Ball wasteland area. Just an area of just hoodoos for miles and desert sands and all that kind of stuff. Feels bloody weird, but we'll see where it ends up going with all of this. With that said, and bearing in mind I've been in a weirdly negative tone for the positives, let us get into the negatives. And as you can probably end up guessing what I'm going to end up saying here, I think this is an episode which was trying to do far too much at once. I feel that the final moments of the riot leading up to Kurogiri, or whatever his name is, getting released could have been their own episode. But that's a line that you could use for any given scene in this episode. The stuff with President Mike, the stuff with Dabi and Shoto, the stuff with Uraka and Toga, it all could have been its own scenes, or rather, it all could have been its own episodes, each and every single one of those scenes. But in the end, they aren't. They could have done a thing where they made it. This episode ended with it being ambiguous if President Mike succeeded or not. Then the next couple episodes or so could have just been each of our characters having these moments, these episodes, these fights, and then a couple episodes down the line towards the end of the season, you get the gut punch that President Mike failed, and that could have been something. I am incredibly reluctant on going down this path of saying what I would have done. I think the way to madness therein lies, certainly when we're talking about literary and film criticism, or television criticism in this case, but that's how I felt with all of that. Because beyond anything else, purely and simply, there's a lot happening here, all of which is conceptually interesting. I will admit that outside of President Mike's decision to have to put his friend down, I don't think anything was quite as thematically or subtextually interesting as that, but still everything we end up getting all the same was still good and interesting for what it was. But again, I still feel as though too much was happening. I think there needed to be a moment of just picking which of these scenes is going to be the main focus of it. Focus on two main areas if you're going to do more than one. Because it ends up leaving this feeling of that, oh, all the stuff with the riot, that probably could have been towards the end of last week's episode. That's how it ends up feeling to me. But still, I think that this is not a bad episode, but at the same time, again, there's just way too much stuff happening, and every single thing that's happening in this episode, I think, is strong and strong enough to be its own episode. And as a whole other thing, to just take even more time away from the stuff that we have within this episode, we have the scene with the weather reporter in America and her protest against appeasing All for One. I mean, it's a neat idea, it's a neat concept, but how the hell would they know that that's an idea? Like, in the context of this series, in the context of this whole series of events, it's only been a few hours since this idea was even mooted to the President of America. Like, how would it have become public knowledge so quickly? Maybe a quirk did it, maybe that's what tipped them off, and now it's started to spread out, but as far as this weather person is concerned, like, she shouldn't really know about all of this. I don't know. Like, it's a neat idea, neat idea, but it just feels really odd. Like, I think that as far as ways to emphasize the global scale of everything that's going on here, there's better ways in doing that. Sure, you don't need to go to the extent of seeing supervillains fighting under Big Ben or anything, but still, there's better ways in doing it, and ways that don't feel quite as odd, and in ways that don't take time for the main series of events. Beyond all of this, another negative that I have is that, and it's only a minor negative, so it may be a bit of a nitpick, I think that at the end of the day, this is an episode where the animation just went back down to standard. Like, after two really strong episodes, this episode just goes back down to standard. Like, there are some moments and some shots where I think that it is good. There's some certainly great moments within the episode, but they're just moments. It doesn't feel like it's the same kind of consistency all the way out. With all that said, as time is rapidly running on, let us get into the overview. And I will say is that, despite my misgivings with this episode, I think it's still decent in and of itself, but I think that a lot of interesting ideas here were ultimately sacrificed in the name of setting up something next. Next week, I should say. It was all sacrificed in the idea of making things more difficult for our heroes and to build this out and to keep this going on for. It feels like a case of this was the thing that was planned, but we decided to bring it forward by 2 or 3 weeks because, I don't know, I think now is a good time for it. Which is a shame because, again, I think that any one scene in this episode could have been its own episode in and of its own right, and in the end it wasn't, and none of it ends up feeling like it's explored or developed to the extent it really needs to. Again, solid episode in and of itself, good episode largely, but there's a lot of missed opportunities here which really do drag it down. With all that said and done, let's get into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner, kicking off once again with Big X1, who says, I like this one, this is of course referring to the previous episode, I like this one a lot, but I think I like the last one even more, which is the episode before the episode before. But it's nice to see Code doing something for once. Thank you for your comment, and I have to say that I really did love last week's episode. I think it's one of my favourite this season. If nothing else, it does feel like a more consistent entity from start to finish. We then move on to Scott TV Gamer. Due to the limited time, I won't going to read all of this out, but they talk about how at the time that this storyline came out in the manga, it wasn't a storyline a lot of people liked, because for one thing, heteromorph discrimination wasn't really something that's been as present in the anime, or really should say the manga, to the extent that arguably it really should have been, and that some people misinterpreted what Shoji's message was going to be at the episode, and how a lot of people, particularly anime fans, who really like this episode, and I have to say is that I'm surprised that a lot of people didn't quite dig into this one when it came out in the manga, but I could understand why, because if you just look at it from a pure ones and zeros perspective, the whole heteromorph discrimination plot thread has not really been a major thing. It's something that's been hinted at here and there. The biggest tip the cap as far as there being a problem with it was the whole blood cult thing a couple seasons or so back, or rather it should have been a couple seasons or so back, but hey, you know how all things, everything went there. But for me, I think the core concept of it is just so universal, and like I said in the review, is something that has been present in comic book culture for so long, is that it's not that esoteric, it's not that hard to understand. Like, this is basically the X-Men thing, but now it's being done in My Hero Academia. Again, to a degree, I think more should have been done with that. I think more should have been a hint of that, but they do excuse it by end up saying that this is all happening in the city. There's more of an acceptance in the city versus out in the country, and that's an idea that I'm going to leave. Just leave it there. Just let sleeping dogs lie with that one. But again, I understand why people aren't maybe as keen on that as maybe I was, but that's just the way things go. Anyway, let me know what you thought about this particular episode. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Were you indifferent towards it? Let me know in the comment section down below, and you won't be ready on in a future video. Most likely next week's video, provided of course we haven't got another skip. But anyway, thank you all for listening, thank you all for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye!
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!